Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me today for Sundays at Home, a time for conversation, camaraderie, and discovering more about the women who have helped shape our world, but have been largely underrepresented in our historical narrative. My name is Emma Rothberg, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum. For those of you who are with us for the first time, welcome. For those of you who have attended an NWHM program before, welcome back, and thank you for your continued support. The National Women's History Museum exists to preserve, illuminate, and share the powerful history of women in America, highlighting both the past and present. NWHM seeks to ensure that women's history is available and accessible to learners of all ages across the globe. Before we begin, please allow me to go over a few housekeeping items. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the museum's YouTube channel in the days following the event. Today's guests are available to answer your questions, so please use the Q&A feature on the tool ribbon to ask any questions that you may have regarding the presentation. You may submit your questions at any time during the presentation, and we will leave time at the end to answer them. This past Friday, we marked Women's Equality Day, which celebrates the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Yet the 19th Amendment did not serve everyone. Many women of color, immigrant women, women who did not speak English, Indigenous women, and women who were members of the disability community still could not vote. The fight for the right to vote didn't end in 1920 and continues today. Our guests today have all worked on the issue of women in the disability justice community, have all worked on the issues women in the disability justice community face when it comes to accessing the ballot box. I'm joined today by three very special guests, Professor Rabia Belt, Michelle Bishop, and our moderator, Professor Cathleen Cahill. Kathleen Cahill is Professor of History at the Pennsylvania State University, who earned her PhD at the University of Chicago. Dr. Cahill's research has focused on everyday experiences of ordinary people, primarily women. She has published multiple articles and 2 books, Federal Fathers and Mothers, A Social History of the United States Indian Service, 1869 to 1933, and won a book award from the Lobelia National American Indian Center at Arizona State University Library and the Weber Clements Book Prize honorable mention from the Clements Center for Southwest Studies at Southern Methodist University. Recasting the Vote, How Women of Color Transformed the Suffrage Movement, which was published in 2020, was awarded honorable mention for the Armitage Jameson Book Prize in Western Women's History and honorable mention for the Society for the Study of the Gilded Age and Progressive Era's President's Book Prize. Dr. Cahill has spoken at many venues, including the National Park Service, at the Library of Congress, and the National Portrait Gallery. Her work has also been excerpted in Ms. Magazine, Time, and the New York Times. She also serves as the steering committee chair for the Coalition for Western Women's History. We are grateful to have Kathleen with us to moderate our conversation. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Michelle Bishop. Michelle is the Voter Access and Engagement Manager for the National Disability Rights Network. She leads a team to support the P&A network on voting rights and voter engagement for people with disabilities. She also works in coalition with the civil rights community in Washington, D.C. to ensure strong federal policy regarding voting rights and election administration from a voter-centric and intersectional perspective. She earned her MSW in Social and Economic Development from Washington University in St. Louis and a BA in Sociology and English Literature from the State University of New York at Geneseo. Michelle loves democracy so much that she registered to vote on her 18th birthday, even though it wasn't an election year. It is ill-advised to get her started talking about the historical significance of the first peaceful transfer of the US presidency or the intricacies of the Electoral Count Act. Disabled herself, Michelle comes to NDRN with over 15 years experience in the disability vote. Finally, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Rabia Belt. Professor Belt is a legal historian whose scholarship focuses on disability and citizenship. Her scholarship ranges from cultural analysis of disability in media to contemporary issues facing voters with disability to the historical treatment of disabled Americans. She is currently writing a book titled Disabling Democracy in America, Mental Incompetence, Citizenship, Suffrage, and the Law, 1819 to 1920, that is forthcoming with the Studies in Legal History series with Cambridge University Press. Professor Belt is also an advocate for people with disabilities. In 2016, President Obama named her as a council member to the National Council on Disability, the independent federal agency that advises the president, Congress, and other federal agencies regarding policies and practices that affect people with disabilities. Additionally, she served as a member of the board of directors for the Disability Rights Bar Association. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Please join me in welcoming our guests and stay tuned for something really exciting.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here on this Sunday, and I will learn a lot from my panelists and from the moderator, and we look forward to your questions. So before we get started, we just wanted to give you just a brief style guide on disability language because people are coming to this topic with varying levels of experience. We just want to emphasize that people's hearts may be in the right place, but our words may not be. So these are suggestions in terms of language that you can use. And I think above all else, right, sort of follow the lead of folks with disabilities themselves. So if you're talking to someone and the language they're using is contradicting what's on this PowerPoint slide that I'm giving you, this PowerPoint should definitely not be the determinant here, sort of follow people's lead. So a few things. One is talking about the disability itself. So we actually have two traditions, one that is more British, in which we talk about a disability before talking about someone as a person, so disabled person. We also have a more American tradition of talking about the disability after using the word person, so person with a disability. In both cases, the idea is that the disability is part of a person's identity, but it is not everything. Because we tend to, especially with folks that have disabilities that are stigmatized, really sort of take it as a disability is their entire being. So we don't talk about, say, quote unquote, schizophrenics, right? We talk about someone who has schizophrenia, someone who's a schizophrenic person. We may talk about someone who is an autistic person or a deaf person, but we really are both thinking about the disability and thinking about the person who has it. There's also tends to be some assumptions about what the disability means to the person and that it's bad, right? Or something that is abnormal. So instead, it's useful to use words like typical as opposed to something like normal or average, because those latter words tend to then sort of make the disability as something or sort of characterize this group of folks as people who are abnormal or people who are not average. Along the same lines, we don't talk about someone being suffering from an impairment or stricken with a disability. Instead, we use more neutral language like someone has it. Certainly, there can be times in which disabilities can be painful, but we leave it up to that person themselves to talk about that experience as opposed to assuming it for the person. When it comes to wheelchairs, wheelchairs facilitate movement. So people use wheelchairs. They're not bound to wheelchairs. So we don't talk about someone being leg bound the same way we don't talk about someone being wheelchair bound. And there's some words that are slurs that we should not use at all. So, for example, midget. So, if we're talking about someone who is of short stature, then we could talk about someone who is a little person or LP for short. There could be particular sort of disabilities that are more specific. So, someone can have dwarfism, for example, but you should not use the word midget in any setting. And there's a distinction between deaf with a capital D and deaf with a lowercase d. So I tend to use deaf lowercase d to talk about the state of not having hearing or sort of having sort of diminished hearing. Deaf capital D, by contrast, is talking about people who are members of the community, right, of folks that are deaf, right? And that tends to be linked to sign language, right? Sort of really sort of becoming part of this minority community. With special needs, so special, it gets used a lot, especially with respect to disabled children. And you may know about special education, the Special Olympics, um, having kids being described as having special needs. Instead, disability advocates say, just say the word disabled, just say disability. You don't need to have a euphemism, but also I think, and this is going to be something I think pretty key to the conversation we have today, disability is tied to a community, it's tied to advocacy, it's tied to rights, it's tied to a history, and talking about special needs in which it is something that is supposed to be distinctive that one asks for, as opposed to something that the society is obligated to give. It's very different sort of connotation there. Um, Another thing that's a little tough is that when it comes to disempowered groups, the terms that are used for them tend to accumulate sort of negative sort of connotations and meanings over time. So there's some terms that when they were first introduced, they were not slurs, but now they are because they're outdated. An example of this is disability versus handicap. So handicap is an outdated word. We don't use it anymore. You may see things like, for example, with like parking signs, and we talk about them being accessible parking places as opposed to handicap parking places. We don't refer to people being handicapped anymore. The same thing with respect to intellectual disability and mental retardation. So don't say the R word anymore. That is something that is a slur. It is a slur. Do not use it. Instead, refer to folks who are intellectually disabled or developmentally disabled or people with intellectual disabilities, but please don't use the R word. And neurodiversity and neurotypical is something that is definitely more conversation is happening around these terms now, especially with respect to the autism community. So this refers to folks in which some people may have brains, right, that are not typical, but that doesn't mean that they're wrong. Nor does it mean that they need to be fixed. Instead, it's a recognition that people present with all different types of brains. And this is like we are on a spectrum of particular types of brains, and we need to recognize the diversity, right, of people's conditions. So, and like many disempowered communities, there are terms that may be used affectionately, or they may be sort of a way to take back words that are used negatively and sort of repackage them. But those are words that they may have some use within a community, right? But they're not words that should be used in an everyday sort of way, or with folks that you don't necessarily know or assume sort of where folks are coming from. So crip and crazy, for example, may be terms that may be used affectionately within the community. Hopefully some of you have seen, for example, Crip Camp, that's on Netflix. So highly recommend it, about folks that were in a summer camp for disabled kids. A lot of those people became really important disability activists. But these are not words that you should use in everyday life, and we will tend to avoid using them here. So this is the beginning, right, of talking about these things, and hopefully it'll be easier to have this conversation right now. And I will stop there and send it over to you, Kathleen.
Great, thank you so much. And I, for one, really appreciate sort of that really very helpful, I think, outline of how to use language respectfully, right? So that we can start this conversation in a way that makes sure that everyone's sort of included in it. And I know that, right, part of being a professor and being an educator is sort of helping people understand how things have changed over time. I think language is something that absolutely changes. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And I want to say thank you to Emma Rothberg for putting this together, and for the National Women's History Museum for inviting us all. I think this is going to be an incredibly important conversation. I was hoping that maybe before I start sort of asking some specific questions, if I could ask each of you to talk maybe just for like 3 to 5 minutes about your work and sort of how you came to study the topic or be an advocate for the question of disability justice and disability rights. And that'll give us sort of a jumping off point. So perhaps Michelle, can we start with you and then go to you, Rabia?
Sure, sounds good. Well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm so thrilled to be here. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and I think we're going to have an amazing conversation. As you heard, my name is Michelle Bishop. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a white woman. I am wearing my signature black plastic rim nerd glasses that I wear all the time. I cannot see without them. And I have curly hair that's usually brown. It's still a little bit blonde because I dyed it purple during quarantine, and that faded but bleaches forever. And I have a virtual background behind me that has a little NDRN logo, if you guys can see it, in the corner as well. So I'm with an organization called the National Disability Rights Network. We're based in Washington, D.C., but the most important thing to know about us is that we're actually a national membership association. So there are disability rights organizations that are federally mandated. They were created by Congress in every state, district, and territory in the United States. We have 57 organizations in our network. So if you're doing the math in your head and you're thinking 50 states, DC, 5 territories, that's only 56, you are correct. The 57th is in the Southwest, and it represents Native Americans with disabilities specifically. The organization in the network that I represent actually does a broad range of disability rights and disability justice work around all things. I tend to talk about voting as if it's life or death. But to be honest, I have colleagues that do real life and death kind of work, right? These are the folks who are monitoring institutions where people with disabilities are living for abuse and neglect, getting people out of those situations, getting some of those institutions that are terrible places shut down, making sure people have access to housing, education, employment, healthcare, working with veterans with disabilities, ensuring that our emergency preparedness procedures for natural disasters are inclusive of people with disabilities, a really broad range of work. But we're also mandated through the Help America Vote Act of 2002 to ensure that people with disabilities have access to the vote. If you remember HAVA, of course, that's that bill that came out of the debacle that was the 2000 election. Remember the hanging chads and the pregnant chads and all those things that happened with punch card systems. That was the bill that got rid of those punch card systems, but it also had a lot of good stuff in it about making voting more accessible for people with disabilities, and created an actual mandate for our organizations to be doing that work. So wherever you are, we have an organization and they are working on access to the vote all of the time, which is how you got stuck with me. I'm based in DC, but I am their primary contact for training and technical assistance, supporting the amazing work that they're doing on the ground all over the country, as well as working in coalition with the civil rights community in Washington, D.C. on federal policy to ensure that we are, when we're thinking about how we administer elections in the United States, we're thinking about it as inclusively as possible and making sure that elections work for everyone.
Great. So I'm inspired definitely from that. So this is Rabia Belt. I'm coming to you from California, and I'm a Black woman with short, dark hair. I'm wearing a headset, and I have a black shirt with, I guess, flowers on it, and my background is blurred so you don't see the mess of my living room behind me. So I wear 2 different hats. The first hat, which is the biggest one, is as a legal historian. I look at how the state was involved in thinking about disability over the long 19th century, right? So the 1800s, in particular about mental disability, because I think that it tends to get short shrift in comparison to physical disability, although both of them are not blessed with an abundance of scholarship at this point, unfortunately. And as Emma mentioned, I'm working on a book having to do with ideas of mental disability and voting over the long 19th century. One in which we saw expansion of the vote. So we got rid of property and taxpayer requirements for voting, and there was movement with respect to race and sex. So we had Black folks that were able to gain the vote, and there were protections within the US Constitution where the 15th Amendment prohibited discrimination on the basis of race for voting, but that protection was really eviscerated on the state and local level because of violence and dirty tricks. So Black folks were not able to vote despite the 15th Amendment, and we didn't really get sort of traction with Black voting again until fairly late, right, with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. With respect to sex discrimination, so we, and I think our hosts are talking about the anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which banned discrimination on the basis of sex, and that was in 1920. So these are things that I think we tend to know about, right? So as Americans, but with respect to thinking about voting and disability, we may not necessarily know that story as much. So there are protections that we do have that are in statutes, right? So ones that Congress has passed, laws that Congress has passed, and the laws that states have passed. And folks like Michelle are like really deep in the trenches in terms of making sure that states and the federal government fulfill its obligations there in terms of access to the vote. Things like curb cuts for wheelchair users, ballot access, things like that. My book also talks about how we think of whether or not someone is confident enough to vote. So I mentioned before, we got rid of those property and taxpayer qualifications. One of the things that states did after they removed those was that they added in all of these restrictions based on mental status. So people, and I'm going to use pejorative language here, sort of people that were designated as insane or idiotic were disenfranchised, along with people who lived in charitable institutions such as lunatic asylums or poorhouses, with this idea, right, that certain people's minds did not qualify them to vote. And there was a race and sex component to this as well, in which there was a justification that certain people as groups, right, sort of Black people and women were not able to vote in part because they were seen as mentally incompetent. Some groups were able to win that argument in terms of saying that they were in fact mentally competent to vote. The problem is, though, we still have in the majority of states now these laws in the books that restrict people's ability to vote based on mental status. And it is still a very ad hoc process, one that is rife with all sorts of issues that can limit people's voting because of like what is perceived about their minds, right? So there's the historical component. And I guess the more recent component in terms of people who are alive, right? Sort of thinking about how the law in particular can do better in terms of how it imagines like what disabled folks' lives are like, and then also like what can be done in terms of making sure that we think of disabled folks as like fully fledged, right, like non stigmatized members of the American community.
Thank you. And I forgot to describe myself, so I apologize for that. But I am, this is Kathleen Cahill, and I am a white woman with light brown hair. I am wearing my blue and white for Penn State, so a blue shirt with white polka dots. And you can see the orange wall of my office behind me that I painted when I got really tired of looking at a white wall during COVID. So thank you both. I think those really help us sort of start the conversation and give us a real sense of the long history of sort of advocacy for disability rights, but also the really complex nature of, right, there are federal laws, there are state laws. And I'm wondering if maybe we should start with this question about, you know, is there a constituency that thinks of itself as a constituency? I mean, Michelle, you're saying right here, there is a group, right, that in every state and territory and indigenous native nations. Is that something new? Is that something that has been around for a while? Sort of when did disability justice and the right to vote, when did people start thinking about that as, you know, something that they had in common with other people? And I actually don't quite know who to throw that question to. I think it could be either of you.
Michelle, you want to start?
I'll take a first stab at it, sure.
Yeah, I think we could both have things we can say about this. Yeah.
We probably do. And we probably both spend enough time staring at data to realize how complex that question is, if you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking. I mean, I look at a lot of polling data of voters, right? Which traditionally people with disabilities are excluded from, but there are some polls out there that do ask whether or not you have a disability and you include that in the polling. And it's really interesting. We did actually a poll once where we asked people that we were polling whether or not they thought that there was a disability rights movement, like a civil rights movement in the disability community. I think the response rate we got of people who said yes was like 45%. And I'm pretty sure I was depressed for like a month after that because I thought it was so low. And the pollsters we were working with said that's actually really high. It's really hard to get anyone to say that at all. So you're actually doing a lot better than you all think you are in terms of instilling this idea of there being a movement in the community. And so it's complex, but I think it's increasing. I think that people with disabilities, the more we were able to get out of, it was so common throughout so much of our history to send people with disabilities away to go live in institutions and to not be a part of society. And the more that changes, the more we're able to, like Robbie was talking about, conceptualize of ourselves as people, not just your disability, but as a person who is a family member, a friend, an employee, an employer who lives and works and plays in your community, and to find each other and to build a community around that. So a lot of the people who founded kind of the modern disability rights movement coming out of like the 1960s were people who found each other and they were like, let's get out of this nursing home, or people who found each other and were at Roberts and the Rolling Quads, who, yeah, don't say Rolling Quads in general. That's one of those terms of the community that Robbie was talking about, who went to UC Berkeley, who were not going to be kept out of UC Berkeley, and who had each other to make that fight with, kind of formed a real sense of community. What we're working on right now is a way of tying that to the vote, making sure that people with disabilities think of ourselves as people with disabilities and think of ourselves as people with disabilities when we're in the voting booth, and are thinking about what good policies and good programs look like that support our independence and our community living and our rights when we're filling out that ballot. So it's probably, as much as any other community, a bit of a work in progress.
Yeah, and I think like many issues having to do with disempowered folks, both on the advocacy side, but then also on the scholarship side, a lot of what we think about is really hidden in plain sight. So, for example, I tell my disability law students, especially over the past few years with COVID, it's watch that we're going to have society do a massive redistribution of resources upend itself. We are all literally on Zoom right now because of our vulnerable bodies. And we are not going to have that discussion as a society as if it is an issue of disability, but it really touches on a lot of the things that disabled folks have been thinking about for a really long time. So I think with respect to disability and in voting, part of it is that there have been a few decades of a self-conscious disability movement, right? Of people that came together because of particular circumstances, like Michelle mentioned with Ed Roberts. A lot of folks that had polio, for example, like we're doing having a resurgence of polio now. It's rather interesting. We have elders, right? So who have polio that came together and recognized that they were in similar circumstances. People that learned lessons from the traditional civil rights movement in terms of thinking about integration and segregation and how that is with respect to subordination, or thinking about the Civil Rights Act, right, of 1964, right, and how we can think about disability and can be a part of that. But there's a lot of folks that could be part of the disability community, and hell, some folks that benefit from work that disability community has done, but they don't necessarily self-identify as such, right? So there can be perhaps overlap, right? So folks that do elder advocacy, for example, with respect to voting, may not necessarily like think of themselves as disabled, but there can be kinship there in terms of stuff. And then there's also like the issue of collateral consequences. So I wrote a piece which you guys can all download if you would like, having to do with contemporary issues with voting, that so many of the things that we deal with now in terms of the voter battleground, a lot of that is done very visibly, right, having to do with like race and partisanship, but they impact the disabled community like pretty strongly. So if we're thinking about, say, long lines or voter ID or transportation to the polls or being in a crowded place, like we can think of a lot of folks, say, people who are not able to stand in a long line for a long period of time, people who need access to food and water, someone who is a veteran with post-traumatic stress disorder that can't be in a crowded caucus area, right? People who have dexterity issues with their hands, or if they're blind and they get a paper ballot. So what does that mean? So a lot of those things, like we think about a lot, right, in terms of disability, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we have enough fellow travelers that could be thinking about it too.
I think a big part of the issue there, not to linger on this too long, but I think big part of the problem there comes from outside the disability community, because I think as a society as a whole, we don't think of disability as a social identity, which for disabled people it is. It's being disabled is part of who you are, the same way your gender, your religion, your ethnicity, your sexual orientation, that's a part of who you are. That's what disability is for disabled people. Max Starkloff, who founded Paraquad Center for Independent Living in St. Louis, was famously once asked, he was a quadriplegic, he had no movement from the neck down, if there was a magic pill he could take tomorrow that would get rid of that, he said he wouldn't take it, because this is who he is. And it made him who he was, and it made his life what it was. And changing that would change so much about himself and the life that he had built for himself. So, and I think non-disabled people don't always get that my disability is just part of who I am. We talk about disability like it's just a medical problem to be cured, or an unfortunate circumstance that non-disabled people are thinking, oh, I'm so glad that's not me. And that's not what it means to people with disabilities. And so we don't always address disability the same way we address other types of civil rights movements and other types of social identities, because we're not categorizing it in the right place, and not necessarily taking our lead from people with disabilities and how we talk and think about disability.
I don't know. I don't know if I entirely agree with you here, right? So, because as someone who is disabled, right? I mean, and there's things that I have that I would be perfectly fine with not having. So if someone gave me a pill and said that you no longer will have depression or you will no longer have PTSD, I would be very happy to get rid of
I
those
absolutely
things.
know people who are like, what's Max talking about? I would totally take that pill because it would just make my life easier, right? So yeah, sure, that's fair, right? I had a colleague who was blind who was like, I totally take that pill. I really wish I could drive a car. The bus is a pain. So sure, there's a practical element to that. But I think Max making that statement, and he meant it for sure. Just kind of put it out there in people's faces that it's not always, disability doesn't have to be a tragedy. It doesn't always have to be something that we're looking for a cure. That we're trying to fix these people. What's the most disabling is that we have not built communities around people that are accessible to and accommodate all of them, when we've always been different and disability has always existed.
I think sometimes, but I think that that's something where I think it depends, right? Like where, in terms of why you are disabled, right? So, and what the disability means. And I think that that may be part of, like, so in terms of Kathleen's question of who is not here, right? Like that, part of that is like, we have some communities versus others that may not be here. So I think in terms of the, for example, like the, what is the disability doing to yourself versus like what society is doing to you, then some mental disabilities, right, like are in a complicated position with respect to what gets foregrounded by the disability community, but then also issues of justice. So for example, like if you are injured by the police, right, because you're Black, then that is something in which, like, thinking about justice and thinking about the harm that has been done to you, and you are now part of the disability community, like that is a complicated conversation to have, right? So I think in terms of the historical stuff, right, like that, there were a lot of folks that are maybe thinking like, I got many things, right, that are putting me down in terms of society. And some folks may be thinking that disability is not the thing that they go to first, right? Like when they're thinking of social injustice. So they may be thinking about their race, or they may be thinking about their sex or their class, as opposed to thinking about disability. I think for all of us, I think all three of us can agree though, right, that we should think about all of these things together, right? And how they're reflective and mutually constitutive. Yeah.
Yeah, and all of those things are complex, and every individual has a right to feel about it however on earth they feel about it, and quite frankly, it can change from day to day, right? My thought is more that in terms of policy, good social policy is whether or not there is a magic pill, whether or not you take that magic pill, society should work for you and should respect your rights. And that should be what drives policy, rather than a pity perspective, or this makes me uncomfortable, so I don't want to think about it perspective.
Absolutely.
So yeah, right? We're on the same, we're on the same page.
We're totally on the
Yeah. So actually, I want to jump off from that, because I think you guys have actually raised a number of things that I had on my set of questions, like COVID. But I mean, I think one thing that people often are thinking when they come to talks like this is, okay, well, how can we do that, right? You've both talked about how the community or society needs to, right? We need to change, and we need to make things more accessible, and we need to kind of broaden who has access. And when we talk about the vote, we are often talking about sort of particularly questions of race. And so I'm sort of curious about, if we kind of shift the lens to questions about disability, and of course the intersections between those, right, which is what you were both just talking about, are essential. But are there, right, if we think of states as laboratories of democracy in Louis Brandeis's terms, and the individual states tend to be the ones that really make the laws about accessibility, are there states that are doing a really good job of this? I mean, Rabia, you mentioned sort of some of these states that are not doing such a good job, right? That a lot of policies that disenfranchise people that might be unintentionally or perhaps intentionally disenfranchising people in the disabled community. But are there states that are doing a good job, or are there models that we can draw from?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yep.
I often think of it as every state is a bit of a mixed bag in my mind. If I looked at any particular state, I'd be like, these are the things you do well that I like. I want to keep these. I want to get rid of these things that I'm not a fan of. And then I'll make a perfect state in my mind that's doing it all right. And I think it's because elections are very complex. And it is a mix of, like you said, there's a lot of state laws, and then there's local jurisdictional practices, and then there are some federal laws. It is a mix. And there is a lot there to regulate. So there are a lot of complex statutes around elections. And so there are always some things that I think we're doing really well, and some things that I think we could be doing better everywhere we look. I think that the one thing that I'm always a fan of when I see it, that I think leads to better policies and practices, is integrating people with disabilities into the process from the start. We have a tendency to design how we're going to run this election, or what voting equipment we're going to use to make those things, and then show them to people with disabilities and say, look at this thing that I made for you. And we say, that is so not accessible. And they say, oh, we are already using it. And it's so much more time consuming and expensive to take something that we made inaccessibly and then try to retrofit it to make it work for everybody. The process works so much better if we involve all the stakeholders that matter, including people with disabilities, into that process, and hear their voices when we're designing something. And with the disability community, I realize how complex that is, because we're all different. And what makes elections inaccessible for someone who's blind versus someone who's deaf versus someone who uses a wheelchair versus someone who has a developmental disability is not the same. They experience different barriers, and they experience them in different ways. So I think sometimes we skip that part because it's complicated and it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. But in my mind, when we see that done and see that done well, it puts us kind of leaps and bounds ahead of some of the more outdated practices that we see. So it's really hard for me to say this state right here, they're doing a great job. And inevitably, if I do, somebody will then tweet at me and remind me of some terrible law they have on the books or something like that I'm not thinking about in the moment. So I'm always so cautious to do that also. But I think that if we put good practices in place in terms of how we make those decisions, then we start to see some good changes.
Mm-hmm. I think we also need to really push that states and localities should not really be laboratories of democracy here, because one of the big problems with voting in the United States is that it is so heavily localized. So you can have a really good practice that happens once in one election precinct, but then we'll have thousands of election precincts across the country, and it's not replicated. And there's been a reliance of having political parties or nonprofit advocacy groups doing a lot of the heavy lifting here, but it really should be an obligation of the federal government to make sure that voting is streamlined and easy to do across the United States and relatively uniform.
I agree so much. Whether or not you have access to your ballot should not depend on whether or not you lived one street over in a different county.
Mhm.
That just doesn't seem in any way just to me. That doesn't strike me as equal protection under the law. And I agree the federal government has a real responsibility here. And I understand the tension that happens between the feds and the states making those decisions. If nothing else, the federal government should be investing a lot more money
Mhm.
into our elections. All of our other rights depend on that right to vote. That is kind of the basis of our government. Did I say kind of? That is actually the basis of our government. Not
But one
kind
thing
of. It's kind of the point.
that
And so we have to invest in it, and we have to treat it that way.
Yeah. And one thing that's hard about it is that it is the hole in the donut, though, right? So if you survey Americans, or if you just ask people, what are the most important rights that we have? Usually it is the right to vote. Sometimes it's freedom of speech, but we don't actually have like an affirmative right to vote in the US Constitution. Even the 15th and 19th Amendments, they have race and sex discrimination in voting, but they don't fill out what it is that voting generally means. And part of the leaving it to the states and localities was a way to allow these folks to be able to practice discrimination, right, against people that they knew, right, and they wanted to prevent them from voting. So we really need to not assume the thing that is there, right, and really push on it. For ordinary people, like the one other thing, right, is that we have fairly predictable dates for voting. We know when election day is coming, which is very different than, say, a parliamentary system in which they will just call a vote. So there's stuff that can happen in advance. So you can ask your Secretary of State, or you can go to one of the protection and advocacy groups, or tweet Michelle, right, and ask them, so what are you going to do? How are you going to have early voting? How are you going to do access? How are you going to get to people that live in care facilities like assisted living or nursing homes? How are you going to help people who are in carceral spaces like jails vote? What about absentee ballots? You can push all of those questions, right? So there are not things that just come up at the last minute or don't get asked at all.
So this is kind of flipping a question I asked earlier, but are the political parties or our politicians sort of thinking about the disabled community as a group of constituents? I mean, are there sort of these pressure points where maybe we can get some of these laws passed? What does that look like?
I think it's entirely possible because we are a huge community. Statistics suggest, I mean, the census would tell you we're like maybe 1 in 5 Americans, but the CDC and Pew Research Center are saying more like 1 in 4. So we're a huge community. That's big, that's diverse, that's all different types of people, and that's all different types of disabilities. But that is a huge constituency by any stretch of the imagination. So the power is there, although those numbers in my mind are potential power. You got to use it, right? If you're not voting, you're not advocating, then, then all it is potential power. It has to be actualized. And so in my experience, you really do have to show that you're paying attention. And that, I'm willing to vote for a candidate who talks about my community and the issues that matter to me. I'm willing to not vote for a candidate who doesn't do that, or who was in office and didn't make good on those promises. That is what makes voting something that's powerful. It is an ability to, it's a bit of a reward and punishment system, right? It's like, if you speak to us and you say you're going to do good things, I will vote for you. And if you do those good things, I'll vote for you again. And if you don't do those things, then somebody else can come and take my vote away from you. So I think there's the potential for so much power. And I think we've leveraged it at certain points in our history. I'd be interested to hear what Rabia thinks, but I think the fight for the Americans with Disabilities Act is a good example of that. I think the sit-ins a few years ago to protect the Affordable Care Act is a good example of that. I think that we, like any other community, also struggle to take that kind of fire that you see in those moments and make it something that's burning in you all the time, which is also a lot to ask of people. And people with disabilities shouldn't be responsible for making those changes and for bearing the discrimination that we face, but it probably won't change unless we do. and I always feel a little bit guilty yelling at people to vote, because I realize it's a bit unfair to ask them to be accountable for these things. But in the back of my mind, I always feel that if we don't, then we won't see those changes that we need and that we want to see. That idea that you have to be the change a little bit. So I think that we have a tremendous amount of potential power. And I think we are sometimes really good at actualizing it. And I think that if we thought of voting, and we talk about voting a lot as like it's a personal thing, like it's a form of personal empowerment, which there's truth to that. But it's also, voting is a numbers game. And it's a type of community power, right? It's not just my one vote, it's my one vote in concert with all these other votes. And that there is real potential there to wield a tremendous amount of power. And I think that we're moving in that direction. But I think that it's a long game. And I think that that can be really frustrating for people when we think, I made the decision, I committed, and I did something, and I want to see change right now.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The potential part is tough, I think, because sort of as we talked about before, because so much of the change and so much of the effort comes from political parties that they move if they think that there is a group in which the investment is worth it with respect to votes. And when it comes to race, there's a pretty tight alignment between race and partisanship, especially sort of after the civil rights movement and the Southern strategy, in which we do see sort of people of color, especially Black Americans, sort of tracking with the Democratic Party and white Americans tracking with the Republican Party. So then that is where sort of the battleground is seen. Whereas with respect to the disability community, because it's a big group and there's different reasons why everyone is in there, then it doesn't have as much of that partisan valence to it. And I think the first assumption, right, sort of politicians is that it's not worth it. We are an expensive community to get out the vote for. But I don't think that that is necessarily the case. So for two reasons. One is that with another thing, right, sort of in terms of legal developments, that as the Voting Rights Act has been eviscerated by the Supreme Court, and we're looking to figure out how to do voter protection and justice, and we don't have the machinery of this act that did a lot with respect to race, then I think that we're now looking for new tools, and disability, because there is this overlap with a lot of folks of color, right, that this is a place that we can look. So with the litigation that happened fairly recently in Texas and Georgia, for example, disability advocacy groups were involved in pushing back the new onerous, nonsensical, right, sort of voting laws having to do with like having water at the polls, long lines, voter IDs, things like that. So talking about disability being a part of those. So that's a way to do a lot of coalition building and sort of raising disability issues. The other thing is, and I think the Republican Party is far better about this than the Democratic Party is, that voting is not just about voting for the president. So there are a lot of levers of political machinery, and a lot of things will happen in your life. There's a lot of money, there's a lot of regulations that happen at the local level. So there's things that we can do in terms of thinking about the school board, thinking about a city council, all of those things which can be really pivotal, and then sort of building up from there in terms of growing power.
Great, thank you guys. And I think a lot of this conversation has given us some really practical places to start working or thinking. And I really appreciate what you both just said about kind of the coalition building, and the fact that thinking about disability rights and access to voting, right, that those changes will of course help the disability community, but also have a broader effect, and that making voting more accessible to any one particular group does often have that sort of effect of making it easier for everybody. So it's something everybody should be thinking about. Emma, I was wanted to throw it back to you to see if there are any questions from the audience.
Yeah, so I just want to say thank you again so much. This has been a wonderful conversation. I realize that we are a little over time right now, but hopefully I can keep everyone here for about 5 more minutes. And also because I did not do this at the beginning, this is Emma Rothberg again. I am a white female. My pronouns are she and her. I have brown hair. I am wearing big brown glasses, and I am standing in front of a white wall with a number of framed items, including my recent PhD diploma. So, you know, gotta flex with that. But yeah, so just for the purposes of time, I'm going to kind of combine 2 questions that came in with the Q&A. And it's, you know, when are we not in an election season? But we're in an election season now. We're approaching a midterm. We're what, 4 months out right now? So, you know, getting down to the wire. So for those who are, you know, they've been paying attention, they're looking to get engaged, they've been energized by this conversation. You've all touched on this, but what are other kind of resources or recommendations that you have for people who want to be involved and remain aware, not only with what's going on with the disability community and their access to the ballot, but, you know, possibly helping, you know, them gain more access?
That's a good question. And I have to say first, I'm so sorry. I feel like we barely scratched the surface of everything we could potentially have talked about today. But also you had me and Rabia here, which we could probably both talk about this for 8 hours without stopping to breathe.
Yep.
I mean, look, this is what we want. We want to, you know,
Right.
jumpstart a conversation and hope to kind of energize people to, you know, learn more. So this has been
I love that.
wonderful.
I love that. I mean, I always think that the most important thing you can do, especially if you are someone who's non-disabled, who thinks, man, I just care about these issues and want something to do, ask people with disabilities what would be most helpful. And that might vary depending on who you know and where you are. So if there's people in your life who you care about, maybe opening up these conversations. Well, I said we have a national network. If you go to our website, ndrn.org, I can drop it in the chat as well. You can actually find our organization in your state and ask them what they've got cooking that they could use your help with, especially with an election coming up. We tend to do things like, there we go, put the website in the chat, open up like hotlines for people with disabilities to call. So if you're trying to vote on election day and you are being denied the ability to cast your ballot for any reason, there's someone you can call that we can make sure that you get to cast that vote before election day ends and you don't miss out on the election. And so they are sometimes looking for volunteers for those kinds of efforts. They go around and visit polling places on election day to make sure that they're set up accessibly and the accessible voting equipment is up and running and all that. They're often looking for volunteers for things like that. So I think there's ways to get involved, but depending on where you are, it may look a little different. So I always think the best place to start is to ask the community what it is that they need. And that's the one thing I can offer. The best thing I can offer is to go straight to our network of organizations and to ask them. Also, if you're a social media kind of person, following disability influencers on social media who are always having really rousing conversations about these issues can be really interesting as well, and a good way to kind of keep educating yourself. That's all I've got. Robbie, do you have other ideas?
Those are very good. I think, well, some of them are in terms of thought process stuff. So when you hear sort of messages that are in the media about voting, thinking about how does this work for the most vulnerable people in our community is useful. We did not talk actually about voter fraud. So voter fraud is one of the things that's used as a justification for voting rules now, right? So like we need to have voter ID or we need to have all of these restrictions because we're worried about voter fraud. The voter fraud that they're talking about is basically just totally made up, right? So asking the questions of what are you talking about when you're thinking about voter fraud, but also usually the solutions that are proposed would actually make it voting even more vulnerable, right, than it would be ordinarily. So really sort of take things with a grain of salt, volunteer, right, to be a poll watcher, to work in a precinct, things like that. Super, super useful. But then also like really sort of making democracy sort of a practice in your life, sort of going to the city council meetings, taking stock of who is your mayor, who are all of these people, right, that are making a lot of decisions that impact people's lives.
Thank you so much for those answers. I just learned something. I mean, I'm based in New York City right now, and we just had one of those, primaries that wasn't on a date that you kind of remember. And I know that, all of this information and knowing, who to look for, what to look for, what organizations, that's really, I find that inspiring. So thank you for sharing. And I do know that we're at time. I would love to continue this conversation with all of you, but it is Sunday. We would like to enjoy the sun while it's still summer. So I want to thank all of you again, and for everyone who's here in our audience for joining us here this afternoon. It is our great pleasure to spend Sunday afternoons in conversation with inspiring guests and the museum community. So if you've enjoyed today's program, then please mark Sunday, September 25th on your calendars, when the museum will be hosting a curator walkthrough of our soon to premiere exhibit, Women Run, Women Win, Latinas in Congress, with me as your host and your presenter. And that event also starts at 3 p.m. And if you are a bookworm, please sign up for our first ever Women's History Book Club, which is going to occur on September 18th. Join us for our discussion of Never Caught, the Washington's Relentless Pursuit of Their Runaway Slave, Ona Judge, by Dr. Erica Armstrong Dunbar. It's a great read. I'm about halfway through it for the second time. So for a full listing of upcoming programs and for registration information, please visit the Public Programs and Events tab at www.womenshistory.org. All events are free, but advanced registration is required. So Kathleen, Michelle, Rabia, thank you so much again for your time and your expertise and for your energy. This has been fabulous. I've learned a lot. I know our audience has as well. And until next time, please stay safe and healthy and have a happy Sunday. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.